Members of Council, Senate, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, good morning, Sanibonani, Molweni. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to Prof. Erna Oliver's inaugural lecture. May I acknowledge Prof. Masemola, the Executive Dean, College of Human Sciences, Deputy Dean, Executive Dean, the college leadership, her colleagues, friends present here this morning. I do acknowledge and welcome Professor P. Prinsloo, Research Professor in Open Distance Learning, the Department of Business Management, who will be our respondent this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, as I take this opportunity to welcome you to the University of South Africa, the University of the Land, I do welcome you at a time we are subjected to stringent COVID-19 pandemic regulations that have also made this inaugural lecture take a different shape altogether. COVID-19 pandemic has caused havoc in the way we do things. The year 2020 in particular will go down in history as a year which defined the new normal. Unfortunately, this happens within disrupted economies and social systems, and more importantly, loss of life in many ways unimaginable across the world. We as UNISA, of course, were not spared. We have lost staff and students, more importantly, family members and friends. Of our major concern with COVID-19 pandemic was the impact it has on our ability to deliver services to our students. We provide study access to our students via our online centers across the country, and due to COVID-19, we have not been able to do so for the most part of 2020, and this has caused substantial grief from our students. We have, through our learning management systems, managed to deliver both the learning content and assessments in ways unimaginable. Our technology saved us and our students the extended academic year. You all know that UNISA is the longest existing dedicated and the largest distance education institution in the world, founded in 1873. Today, it is, of course, 148 years old. We cater for the student population that is equivalent to 1/3 of all South African higher education institutions and constitute 92.4% of all students enrolled in distance learning programs in 2019. Historically, this university is perhaps the only university in South Africa who have provided all people with access to education, irrespective of race, color, or creed. Today, we also pride ourselves for having the first woman principal and vice chancellor in 148 years. This is indicative of our efforts to ensure that UNISA continues to be the transformative university in the service of humanity. As a comprehensive university, open distance learning institution, we are guided by the principles of lifelong learning, student-centeredness, innovation, and creativity. Because of CODEL, we contribute to the knowledge creation, advancement of humankind, and development of a critical citizenry to advance global sustainability. We achieve this through our learner-centered approach, which provides for lifelong learning in a flexible learning environment through interactive learning materials, thereby increasing access into higher education for most disadvantaged learners. We also pride ourselves in the development and promotion of our own staff so that they can continue to support our students and communities around us. We are grateful that this inaugural lecture is taking place within the context of our renewed spirit, in the context of our revised UNISA 2020 strategy and our strategic plan. In some ways, Prof. Oliver's inaugural lecture has come at the right time. It is the time for the serious consideration of transformation ideals within the context of UNISA, our higher education sector, and South Africa as a whole. We are very proud that today, UNISA continues to demonstrate the value of a strong cadre of professorship that is necessary to instill our students critical thinking and analysis of the highest order. This is a very proud moment for every academic as it reflects one of the pinnacles of academic achievement. It gives us great pleasure that our rank of full professors is growing substantially, and we are of the view that such will grow our research expertise in leaps and bounds in South Africa, our continent, and the world. Ladies and gentlemen, in terms of today's proceedings, Prof. Masemola will introduce Prof. Oliver and invite her to the podium. Prof. Prinsloo will then follow Prof. Oliver with a response without any further announcements. I now invite Prof. Masemola to the podium. I thank you.
Vice Chancellor Professor Nkebula, and Professor S.K. Ndlovu, the Vice Principal of Strategy, Risk and Advisory Services, members of the extended management of the university, members of the College of Human Sciences management. Allow me in particular to recognize the school director, Professor Rothni Chaka, members of the university community at large, and I extend, particularly this moment, a very warm welcome to the family of Professor Erna Oliver. Professor Erna Oliver has attained the most impossible of things in terms of a very illustrious career. And today the university is making it clear to the entire university community that it recognizes the meritocratic strides that she has taken. If anything, what we are doing here today is affirm the meritocratic achievements, because she is herself a meritorious scholar who has made herself quite palpable in the presence of journals of high standing, publishing houses of good, sound repute. She is one of those people who make the university community proud. And today, because we recognize merit and we celebrate it, we allow Professor Erna Oliver to shine and give her snippets of the trajectory of her scholarship that make her the great scholar that she is. But who is Professor Oliver? Professor Oliver was born Erna as the middle child of Danny and Maria Venter, and spent the first 9 years of her life in Randburg, Johannesburg, after which the family moved to Pretoria. She went to Oosmoed High School and afterwards to the University of Pretoria to study theology. She completed the BA Honours, BD, and Master of Divinity degrees in 9 years, after which she and her husband went into the ministry together, first in Pretoria West and later in Nelspruit. After about 10 years in ministry, the family moved back to Pretoria, and Anna completed her DTH degree at UNISA as a beneficiary of the David Bosch Prestige Bursary. In 2006, she was invited to become a research assistant in the discipline of church history in the Department of Christian Spirituality, Church History and Missiology at UNISA. Her dream of becoming an academic came true when she was appointed as a senior lecturer in the same department in January 2011. In 2012, she was one of the first group of unisans who enrolled for the combined University of Maryland University College and UNISA Master's degree in Education in Open Distance Learning. And she was also among the first to graduate in the year 2016. Erna served on the executive body of the Church History Society of Southern Africa, CHSSA, between 2009 and 2015, and is currently serving on the executive committee of the Higher Education Learning and Training Association of Southern Africa, HELTASA. During her 15 years at UNISA, Anna published 50 articles and book chapters in accredited journals and books on subjects related to theology and open distance learning. She is an editorial board member of 3 international journals and has acted as sub-editor for the 5-year Reformation Special Collection named Change Agency Project, or CAP, with HTS Theological Studies between 2017 and 2021. Together with her husband Willem, she was also sub-editor for the 2019 HTS Theological Studies Special Edition collection called God as One. She is a prolific reviewer who reviewed more than 240 articles, books, and book chapters for accredited publishers. And I would like to further bring it to attention of the community now that Anna attended and presented at 50 international academic conferences, 26 national conferences, and 17 local conferences. She also hosted an organized international conference in Dallas, Texas in 2020, just before the pandemic struck, and since then organized 2 virtual international conferences. At UNISA, Professor Oliver serves in several committees, participates regularly in mentorship and talent management programs, and served as discipline leader and open distance learning specialist in the department. She's the honors coordinator and is constantly involved with curriculum development for church history, while also attending to a large number of master's and doctoral students that she supervises. But tonight is the night when she gets to showcase her very extraordinary scholarship by giving us this inaugural lecture, which she has aptly titled The Unfinished Business of Church History. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you tonight the inaugural lecture, such as is presented by Professor Anna Oliver. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Prof. Inaugural, Vice Principal, Strategy, Risk and Advisory Services, for your words of welcome. Thank you, Prof. Masamula, Executive Dean of the College of Human Sciences, for your kind introduction. Thank you, my dear colleague, Prof. Paul Prinsloo, Research Professor of the College of Economic and Management Sciences, for being my respondent. And to my darling husband and colleague, Dr. Willem Oliver, thank you for altering each PowerPoint slide to my exact specifications. Good morning and welcome to you, my family, friends, colleagues and students, all of whom I shared some history with. Some of us share a long history since childhood days, and others of us, our shared history only started recently. Thank you for being here today, and thank you for sharing this day. In the past, at events like these, we could actually see each other and talk to each other. But then COVID happened, and our lives changed dramatically. At first, in February 2020, I thought, this too shall pass. And within a few weeks, hopefully, we will be back to normal. And then I thought of the wise words of John Torpey, who said that the past rushes in when the future collapses. And being an historian, I started to ask Dr. Google some questions, on which I received shocking answers that shattered my hope of returning to normal. Most of us, at some stage, I think, compared the COVID-19 pandemic with the 1918 flu that actually started in February 1918 and only ended in April 1920, after 4 successive waves that infected about 5 million people, which was a third of the world population and killed millions. And of course, there are many other pandemics and epidemics. Some of them was even recently, such as the swine flu pandemic of 29 and 2010, the Zika epidemic of 2015 and 2016, and the Africa Ebola pandemic of 2040 to 2016. By now, I can imagine that some of my colleagues are rolling their eyes and thinking to themselves, so what do pandemics have to do with the unfinished business of church history on which she is supposed to speak? Well, colleagues, the short answer is everything. Because if you are so lucky to be an historian, you will know that everything is connected to everything. Where then do pandemics and church history connect? Let me provide you with 3 small, short samples. In the year 252, when the plague broke out in Alexandria in Egypt, Pope Dionysius, together with a few priests and deacons, voluntarily assisted the sick and buried the dead, knowing very well that they too could die. They became known as the Parabolani, the people who risked their lives as nurses, and people were amazed by this death-defying courage that Christians displayed to assist others, including those who persecute them. Later, in 360, Emperor Julian penned down his amazement about the Christian lifestyle. At that point in time, Christians were marginalized and not in high regard with either the government or society. He remarked about the Christians' kindness to strangers, their humble and peaceful lifestyles as an example for the rest of society, and their care for the sick and the dead, of those who regarded them as scum. And while we know that the sick were banished and isolated by the ancient civilizations, do you know that the word quarantine that we use today comes from the word quaranta, meaning 40 in Italian? The period of 40 days for isolation or quarantine was not chosen on medical grounds, but on religious ones, as the Bible makes multiple references to the number 40 in relation to purification, such as the cleaning of the earth through the 40 days of rain in the time of Noah, and the purification of the Israelites through the trek of 40 years to the Promised Land. The earliest formal 40 days quarantine in the modern world that we know of was imposed during the Black Death that killed a third of the Europeans between 3047 and 3051. But not only during the early Christian era or the Middle Ages did history and religion and belief systems shape and influence lives. Today, history and religion are still important agents of change. Because humans are adaptable, even major changes in religion can often happen without much upheaval. Again, let me explain, this time with an example from our own history. In 1994, South Africa became a democracy, and we got a new constitution that guarantees religious freedom. Although South Africa never was a Christian country, more than 80% of the population claimed to be Christians. And we had to adapt quickly to not being the privileged religion anymore. Ascension Day ceased to be a public holiday, and the school curriculum on religious education changed drastically. But there was no civil war about this major change, which could well have been the case if this was to happen in 5064, when Theodore Beza succeeded John Calvin in Geneva, because Beza called the idea of religious freedom a devilish and Mohammedan dogma. So, with time, things change and people adapt. Back to our day-to-day living. Just think for a moment how things changed over the past 40 to 50 years. Do you remember these? But it is not only things that change. Concepts and ideas also change over time. And we as Christians know very well that people also change. The Bible tells us about Peter, the fisherman, who denied knowing Jesus, but later became the rock upon which Christ built his church. Due to the changes in the lives of people and the first Christians, we can call ourselves today Christians. My conclusion from this first part of my presentation is this. We know that change is part of life and part of history. What is much more important is that we must know how to handle change. The next question today for us is this. When last did you change your mind about something important? I am not talking about changing your mind about what you're going to wear or what you will have for dinner. Yes, those are important because wrong choices can bring you into big trouble. But this is really about changing your perception or opinion or your belief or your judgment about something. Well, if you are like me, you will have to confess that such changes do not happen frequently nor easily. You see, I have been long enough on earth to know who I am. I know what I like and don't like. I know what I can do and what I can't do. And I think my husband and children would confirm that I tend to think that I'm seldom wrong and that I'm always know best. So no, I am not into the change business. But this is a huge but. There are exceptions. I can remember 2 such important changes of mind, followed by a change of life decisions I made in the past 20 years. And the results were stunningly positive and awesome and brought me great happiness and renewed passion. And when we talk about one of these passions, which is my work, if we discuss theology and the church and church history, I have strong opinions about what should change, why it should change, and in some cases even how it should change. Part of this is what I will speak about next, the unfinished business of church history in South Africa, and how this also challenges you and me to change our ways of thinking and our actions to make some of these needed changes happen. And now some of you will ask, how do you connect change and transformation with church history? Why do you focus on the past? The past can't change, it is dead and gone. Yes, the past cannot change. But our perceptions of the past can change, and it should change, especially when we discover that these perceptions are wrong. This normally happens when we acquire previously unknown information about a specific event, and when we identify discrepancies in the story and then start to search for the correct information. Sometimes cognitive dissonance assists us to alert us that the facts or the logic or the importance that we link to an event just does not add up. Let me explain again with an example. I remember from my childhood days that story about Marie Antoinette, who suggested that people who did not have bread should eat cake. Where did we get this information? From Jean-Jacques Rousseau, of course, who wrote his Confessions in 1766, in which he quoted these famous words uttered by a princess named Marie. Today, we know that he did not refer to Marie Antoinette because in 1766 she was 11 years old, and by then this saying was a well-known expression. So after further investigation, it is now presumed that Rousseau probably referred to Maria Therese, wife of Louis XIV, who reigned about 75 years before Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. We are far more conditioned by the past than we think. Many of the current crises that we are grappling with, whether economic, political, social, whether national or even personal, are the fruits of a historic event. For example, due to mistakes made in the past, we had to cope with load shedding for the last 14 years since 2007. And if those mistakes are not corrected and repeated, we will probably continue to be in the dark for years to come, because what happened in the past is influencing the present. History is indeed capable of casting long shadows over the past and the present and the future. The words of Stephen, a character from a novel written in 1922 by James Joyce, is a statement of despair about the influence of history on his life. He said, "History is a nightmare from which I am trying to awake." In addition to describing the horrors of war as nightmarish, history is compared to nightmares in an ever-increasing array of topics, such as colonialism, genocide, human trafficking, and other atrocities, including pandemics. To this, politician historian Michael Ignatieff commented in 1998, "If history is a nightmare, the past is not past." In South Africa, history is often regarded as synonymous with nightmares because most of us are still emotionally linked to the collective traumas of the past. This is true of both the South African history in general and the history of the free traditional Afrikaans-speaking churches, on which I will focus my attention next. They are the Nederduits Hervormde Kerk van Afrika, the Nederduits Gereformeerde Kerk, and the Gereformeerde Kerke in Suid-Afrika, to which I will simply refer collectively as the churches. And I will comment on a few of the most important unfinished business issues in Afrikaner church history. So these will then serve as the headings to the next section that I will speak. The idea that time progresses and unfolds towards a better and improved future crushed and crumbled during the last 50 years. Consequently, the sharp separating lines between present, past, and future began to blur and fade away. Pierre Nora says this opened a road for a new and different way of working with history. Instead of looking for causes, instead of asking why something happened, in this example, asking why did it snow, instead we now search for the effects of that history, how that events influenced the lives of people, whether positive or negative. And instead of actions remembered and events commemorated, we seek and now investigate the marks and the scars that these events left, and how the actions influence the life of people. We are much more aware of the afterlife, of the lasting change that it brings, again, positive or negative, and the lingering effects of actions on society. The way history is written can also cause problems for future generations. And South African church history provides a good example of such problematic history. Think for a moment. Isn't it strange that amongst the Afrikaners, with no significant differences in language, culture, or worldview, within 30 years after the voortrekkers settled in the northern publics, there were already 3 major Afrikaans-speaking churches that continued to splinter into more denominations and branches over the next 150 years, while all adhere to the same confessions, including confessing one general church, een heilige algemene kerk. When the schisms happened, the members and leaders of these churches accused each other of being false and corrupt, liberal or Methodist. They quibbled about the name of the church, about which songs to sing, and decided not to recognize each other's baptisms. At one point, fanatic groups were ready to take up arms against each other to fight for their views and their interpretations of religion and history, and what is right and what is wrong. And of course, the mission churches were kept separate from the mother churches. Jan Assmann calls this memo history, meaning that we remember an event differently from how it actually happened, or as more important than what it actually was or actually should be. Jan's wife, Aleida Assmann, compared this kind of history writing to packing a suitcase with items that are deemed important to keep certain traumas and events alive and remembered as important evidence for future use as either a weapon or a defense mechanism, and in the case of the South African church history, as both a weapon and a defense, to sustain the existence of each individual church. Why do I say this? Well, because after the failed unification process of 1885, an interchurch commission between 3 mainstream denominations was established in 1958 to again try to promote unity between these churches. But after 50 years, it was concluded that it's not realistic to keep on pushing for unity, and the focus shift to cooperation, which guarantee a safe niche area for each denomination. Why? Because if the heresies and schisms must be faced and rectified, church members will be left rest-faced and embarrassed, and several church leaders will be out of jobs. Can you see how difficult it is to change the perceptions of people who choose to believe their own interpretations of events to protect their personal interests, even if they know they are wrong. So, to this day, each of these denominations still see themselves as owners of the true church. Through the God is on our side construction of history by denominational biased church historians who wrote history in a selective way and emphasis on certain events and aspects to be normative for future generations. And people still buy into this kind of history writing and manipulating of history, unfortunately. It is therefore no wonder that the Afrikaans-speaking churches are on their deathbeds. Contributing to the current terminally ill status of the institutional churches are the complex identity crisis, the downgrading of faith to a mere label, and the constant stream of diversions. Let me start with diversions. There is always something, and most of the time, more than one thing, that grips the attention of the institutional churches to such an extent that it prevents them from staying focused on their calling. Apart from the historical accusations and more recently the apartheid theology, this spotlight of diversion also fell on the Balhaar Confession, on the existence of the devil, on the use of wine or grape juice, in glasses or in cups, women as clergy, the place that theological education in higher education institutions should have, the religious rights and privileges of LGBTQ people, and cohabitation, just to name a few. Although more than 80% of the South African population claim to be Christians, our crime, violence, abuse, corruption, murder, road rage, and domestic violence statistics are constantly on the top 10 list in the world. This does not make sense. Who is then responsible for the crimes if we are all Christians? What it implies is that we are Christians in name. Our faith is a convenient label. And I say we, because although I do not murder people, or beat them, or steal from them, I do sometimes behave badly, especially in traffic, and I lose my temper, especially in the bank. So what I mean is I, who confess to be a Christian, is contributing to make my faith a worthless tag. No wonder the church seems to be lifeless, mute, paralyzed, blind and deaf for the cries and the needs and the questions of society. When last did you hear these churches say or do something or answer difficult questions about termination of life by choice, euthanasia, abortion, suicide, cloning, genocide, stem cells, and DNA manipulation? Or do we regularly hear about church interventions on modern-day slavery, on human rights, on free will, the death penalty, corruption, crime, and violence? And what are the church's guidelines on ecological issues such as earthkeeping, global warming, endangered species, or life on other planets? Shouldn't these issues keep the church in the news headlines every single day? Regarding identity, South African history is normally painted either from the side of the Afrikaners, who present it as a struggle for independence and freedom, or from the side of Africans and their struggle for liberation, while both groups build their history and their identity on their status as historical victims. Both history lines are closely linked with theology and embedded in a sense of holiness. African history is founded upon liberation theology, black theology, and social gospel, while the Afrikaner interpretation of history is constructed upon the chosen people fundamentalism and the covenant concept of the Old Testament. This unfortunately mix of ideology, history, and theology in South Africa is one of the major reasons why the Rainbow Nation is still experiencing an identity crisis that makes them unable to come to terms with themselves, with each other, and with their religion. So, when the short-lived Afrikaner reign ended in 1994, many Afrikaners were unable to adjust positive to the new dispensation. Afrikaner religious identity crumbled when the apartheid theology was exposed and trust in the leadership of the churches evaporated, while serious questions remained unanswered to this day. But, yes, there is again a huge but. Everything is not lost. Despite all the mistakes, confusion, transformations, entanglement with human bitterness, faith and hope will prevail. Although each of my next 3 points also starts with a negative note, they all carry the seed of new life. The Protestant Reformation tried to bring believers back to serving God, but some of the old systems stayed firmly in place, like male dominance, the hierarchical Geneva Church governance model, the idea that church equals a building, and the dependency model that literally crossed out the principle of the priesthood of all believers. Today, believers do not have to use their gifts and take up their responsibility to practice their faith at work, at home, in car, and also when completing their income tax forms. We go to church and come back the same way. Often when we speak about church, we mean a place, a building, or church leaders, or governing bodies. We don't mean us. Church is something, not someone. Afrikaner churches got stuck in the 19th century, and another important principle of continuous reformation or semper reformanda just died. Join me for a moment in daydreaming. If we, the Christians in South Africa, start to live our faith out responsibility, everywhere and to everyone, and if through the principles of priesthood of all believers and continuous transformation, Christians will be able to reach out, assist, and care for society and the environment as and when and where we see the need. What a country this would be. What a testimony we would be, and what a light the Rainbow Nation would have to shine. Afrikaner churches in general are called Calvinistic, but Afrikaner religious spiritualism is a complex mixture that Simon correctly compares to a dam. The Dutch Reformed tradition was the only official inlet into this dam between 1652 and 1795. However, rivers and streams, as well as brooks and creeks of variable lengths and volumes, continuously contributed to fill the dam from both official and unofficial sources for nearly 370 years. Built upon Puritanism, and the Revival, the Second Reformation, or the Nadere Reformatie, bloomed and opened the way for the evangelical Methodist influences. Then, the Dutch Calvinism of Abraham Kuyper and the new Fijian romantic nationalism brought floodwaters into this reservoir, resulting in the creation of a murky Afrikaner civil religion, which promoted an everything goes mindset. Christians are now acting as if they are in a shop, seeking and choosing and buying into different spiritualities every few months or years. This consumerism leads to increased accusations and labelings, stereotyping, and even more owner of the truth arguments without adding any positives to the current debates. If, however, Afrikaner Christians test the water samples from this dam of South African spirituality, they will find a wealth of knowledge, insight, virtues, quality, moral guidelines, and practical lifelines that can be used productively to construct a new and a fresh spirituality and theology and an alternative way of Christian living in our country. And this brings me to the last point, the missiological void. The South African Missionary Society was only founded in 1799, 150 years after the first settlers came to South Africa. There are more than 30 languages spoken in South Africa. Only in 2012, the Bible was finally translated into all 11 official languages. There are still about 10 South African languages that do not have any part of the Bible translated yet. It is unacceptable that a technologically driven society lacks the eschatological vision to promote the basic principles of contextual missiology. Already in 1980, Staples exclaimed, "Without a doubt, the Church has and is failing the execution of the Great Commission of her Lord." For South Africa, Missio Dei must mean a 180-degree turn from inward to outward focus, from maintenance of church buildings and pastor salaries to outreach and caring for those in need. It must mean daily risk-taking, living dangerously dependent on God to bring new life and hope and salvation. So, why do we still bother with church history? Well, to pause for a moment and to stand in awe, because faith is still alive. To take heart and to gather courage for the way forward. To be different. To boldly face and clean up the unfinished business of the past. To put the nightmares to bed. And to make history, history. And then to start all over again. I thank you.
Allow me firstly to acknowledge Prof. Ndlovu, Vice Principal Strategy, Risk and Advisory Services, Prof. Masemola, Executive Dean of the College of Human Sciences, the family, friends, and colleagues of Prof. Erna Oliver, and lastly and most properly the most important person at this occasion, Prof. Erna herself. Allow me secondly to acknowledge the reality that when Prof. Oliver invited me to be the respondent to her inaugural, I did not hesitate 1 second to accept the opportunity. Not only do I have huge respect for her passion for teaching and learning, but in 2016 we have been fellow students in a Master's in Technology Enhanced Education offered by the University of Maryland University College in Washington, D.C. I don't know why I thought that somehow her inaugural would have been about the use of technologies in the teaching of church history in the context of the comprehensive, open, distance, and e-learning institution. You can imagine my shock when I read her first draft of her inaugural and realized that there was nothing in the text that looked vaguely familiar. Out of respect for Erna and the auspiciousness of this occasion, there was no way that I could retract my acceptance at that stage, and here I am. I am furthermore very aware that many of Prof. Oliver's colleagues may be curious to how she could have invited someone from outside the disciplinary ranks of the Department of Christian Spirituality, Church History, and Missiology. I have immense respect for these colleagues in the department, and knowing and respecting their caliber added pressure on not letting Prof. Oliver down in my response. Delivering this response from a position outside of the Department of Christian Spirituality, Church History, and Missiology allows me, however, also a bit of freedom. A freedom almost like the liberty a jester or clown had during the medieval carnival, or the liberty of persons wearing the masks of monkeys and jackals in traditional African festivals and rituals. The clown or the mischief maker had license during the festival or ritual to provoke, to tease, to have fun, and to criticize the powers to be. In delivering this response, allow me then as outside clown and mischief maker to reflect on your inaugural. You started your inaugural by acknowledging many of those present with whom you share a history. You also reminded us that the COVID pandemic is not a unique event, but that pandemics are more frequent in human history than we care to remember. You linked the history of these pandemics with the unfinished business of church history based on your claim that in history and the study of history, everything is connected to everything. With this as background, you introduce the focus of your lecture, namely the unfinished business of church history in South Africa. You then contrasted two statements regarding history. Firstly, a statement by a character in James Joyce's novel 1922 that history is a nightmare from which he was trying to awake. And the second statement comprising the words of the politician historian Mikhail Ignatieff, who commented in 1998, if history is a nightmare, it is because the past is not past. You then turn to the specific history of the free traditional Afrikaans-speaking churches and reflected on the realization that the assumption that with time there is progress and an unfolding of a better and improved future crushed and crumbled during the past 50 years, and consequently the sharp separating lines between present, past, and future began to blur. You reflected on how early in the history of the Afrikaner, three distinct church traditions started, each laying claim to being the only one true church. In recounting and defending these three different traditions, the history is, in the words of Aleida Asman, like a suitcase filled with important traumas and events, with the sole purpose to keep them alive, and as important evidence for future use as either a weapon or a defense mechanism. Despite attempts in 1958 to move towards church unity, these suitcases were opened and the past became present. You said that apart from the historical accusations and more recently apartheid theology, the spotlight of diversion also fell on the Baalhar confession, the existence of the devil, wine or Jews from cups and glasses, women of clergy, the place of theological education in higher education institutions, the religious rights and privileges of LGBTQI people, and cohabitation, to name just a few. Despite the passion with which these issues continue to be discussed and serve to divide these churches, you questioned the church silence on inter alia, crime, human rights, slavery, and the unfolding ecological disaster of climate change. You furthermore stated and contrasted the retelling of African history and Afrikaner interpretation of history. You said African history is founded upon liberation theology, black theology, and social gospel, while the Afrikaner interpretation of history is constructed upon the notion of the chosen people and the covenant concept of the Old Testament. You also said that when the theological support for apartheid was being questioned, Afrikaner religious identity crumbled. You concluded your lecture by referring to several issues that should be addressed, such as the continuing nature and demand for reformation, how the dam of South African Christian spirituality may result in alternative ways of Christian living, and the number of South African languages in which there are still no language translations available of the Bible. You pleaded for an outward focus instead of an inward focus to clean up unfinished business and to put the nightmares of history to bed. It is said that it is the victor, the conqueror, who writes history and who pays songwriters to write the songs of victories, as well as to pay artists to create sculptures and public monuments, not only to sediment the victory, but also to ensure the stories are retold and never forgotten, and other stories never told. What is mostly absent from these official, sanctioned, and taught histories are the histories and the stories told by victims, albeit often not necessarily with monuments and public parades, in songs, in arts, and in graffiti against the walls of our gated suburbs. In a reflection on the future of church history, Robert Foslow comments that we cannot and should not talk about the future of church history without accounting for its past. He states that the future of church history as an academic discipline depends on its ability to contribute towards a responsible engagement with a Christian past in a culture of historical amnesia and harmful memory. As Dennis indicates, church history has always been a theological project done with little regard for social sciences and often with no training in secular history. Dennis also points to how South African church history has always been, and I quote, polemical, culturally restricted, ethnically bound, and narrowly based geographically. Church history in South Africa has for many years been the claim of white theologians and church historians, often ignoring the unholy alliance between the colonial project and the missionary zeal. And while you refer to attempts to unify the Free Afrikaner white churches in 1958, just 2 years later, in 1960, these free churches unified in their opposition against the Cottesloe consultation, and they opted, unified, to leave the World Council of Churches and go into ecumenical isolation. Everything is connected to everything else. For many in South Africa, the history of Christianity in Africa is part and parcel of the historical anthropology of colonialism and consciousness, culture and power, of an anthropology concerned at once with the colonizer and the colonized, the structure and the agency. So how does one talk about the unfinished church business of church history with specific reference to the role and the current state of Free Afrikaner churches? Can we talk about these histories without opening the suitcases? Foslow refers to Paul Ricoeur, who said we suffer from both too little and too much memory. He then states, we seemingly live in a world where there is, on the one hand, historical amnesia and an unhealthy loss of memory, while on the other hand, processes of commemoration are often abused in the service of harmful, ideologically driven projects of identity construction. So how do we engage with the past of church history? Foslow pleads for a history from below, referring to such an approach as for being interested in those aspects which have been left out of the story, which were the vast majority of human beings, almost all women obviously, but then all those who could be counted among the socially inferior, the economically distressed, the politically marginalized, the educationally deprived, or the culturally unrefined. The official history is written by the victor and those in power, often masking the injustices committed under the founding events, while a church history written from below offers access to a variety of sources to challenge and to deconstruct that which is sometimes described as the official history of the Free Afrikaner churches. Reconsidering church history has to be a collaborative exercise of everyone surrounding the founding events, and also include other disciplines such as anthropology, sociology, and others. Vosloo concludes his arguments for a church history from below by suggesting that we should stop thinking of our histories and our past as if our histories and our past have not been part of other histories and pasts. If I can make a link between Vosloo's proposition and your statement that church history is connected to everything else, we cannot exclude and disconnect the emergence and the continued contestation between the Free Afrikaner churches as disconnected from everything else. Much of current historiography in South Africa is shaped by stories of suffering and struggle. And globally, suffering is a permanent part of the identities of millions of peoples. We can only think of the millions of permanent refugees and immigrants, the millions who face unemployment as a permanent part of their identity, as well as the incredible suffering of the Palestinian people under the occupation of Israel. In your lecture, you referred to the words of Aleida Asman, who said that our memories function like suitcases filled with important traumas and events with the sole purpose to keep them alive. And you also referred to when the theological motivation for apartheid was questioned, Afrikaner religious identity crumbled. Allow me then to conclude my response to your lecture by briefly reflecting on these suitcases of memory, suffering, and identity. In the specific context of South Africa, the unimaginable suffering of millions of South Africans as a result of colonialism and apartheid still shapes the lives of millions, and its legacy will last for many more generations. While the Truth and Reconciliation Commission attempted to get to the truth of the atrocities and the inhumane structural arrangements, a large part of the white Afrikaner population was untouched and continued to be untouched. It is noteworthy that of the Free Afrikaner churches mentioned in your lecture, only the Dutch Reformed Church made a submission. It's also noteworthy that the submission was not on behalf of the church. For many Afrikaners, the TRC was a witch hunt, and the Afrikaner was again, like so many times before, the victim. At the unveiling of the Voortrekker monument, D.F. Malan stated, and I quote, "The history of the Afrikaner reveals a determination and a definiteness of purpose, which makes one feel that the Afrikanerdom is not the work of man, but the creation of God. We have a divine right to be Afrikaners. Our history is the highest work of the architect of the centuries." Close quote. Reflecting on the Afrikaners' lack of remorse or amnesia, David Bosch said that this may indicate a pathological preoccupation with survival and a lager mentality. To admit any wrongdoing would effectively render the lager defenseless. Much of Afrikaner nationalism and the role of the church can be understood by pointing to the centrality of suffering in the identity of the Afrikaner and the Afrikaner churches, whether in referring to the big trek into the interior, the suffering under the English, the First and Second South African Wars and a genocide in the concentration camps, being misunderstood at the TRC, and being on the receiving end of what many Afrikaners describe as counter-affirmative action. In a wonderful book by Esther Ben-Bassa, with the title Suffering as Identity, The Jewish Paradigm, Ben-Bassa maps how Jewish identity throughout the ages, but especially after the Holocaust, had been shaped by suffering, the retelling of suffering, up to the point where suffering becomes identity. And while her account of suffering as identity as a dominant paradigm is remarkable, it is her reflection on history that are, in my view, worthy of reflection on a day like today. She writes, and I quote, The various instances of the past suffering accordingly enter into competition for the attention of the public and the powers that be. The more obscene suffering seems, the better its claim to compensation of the kind supposed to make it disappear. Suffering and repentance beget each other endlessly, until finally they produce new forms of suffering in their turn, while making it impossible to make plans for the future. Suffering creates victims. Victimhood is then transformed into moral posture. End of quote. Bembasa maps suffering, memory, and identity of these suitcases with the sharpness of a surgeon's scalpel. She claims that the slavery endured by one's ancestors, the colonization to which one's parents and grandparents were subjected, the genocides and the endlessly revived memories of them all serve in their own way to cement identities and forge clearly distinct groups in this age of globalization and the weakening of national identities. In the construction of Jewish history, Jews became the suffering people. Suffering became not only the vital element in Jewish identity, but in fact became their identity. Such utilization of memory of suffering often stands in the way of a proper understanding of history, which makes it harder to maintain the appropriate distance between history and emotion, history and memory. Suffering took primacy over history. Writing Jewish history offered a way of remaining Jewish by codifying what being Jewish means, resulting in a modern history of the Jews that was written in tears, lacrimosa, inspired by the story of suffering. Identity, memory, and history became one. After the Holocaust, people no longer spoke of the obligation to preserve history, but to preserve memory. Not only suffering, but also victimhood. So, in conclusion, how does one restore history and claim back the telling of stories from memory? Bembasa says, history rescues us from the tyranny of memories and its self-appointed high priests, not for a lack of respect for those whose memory it is essential to honor, but simply so that this obligation does not lead to the neglect of the simple right to justice and recognition. We therefore have to incorporate memories in history and rewrite history, because history rationalizes memory, provides it with a framework, protects it from deviations, and make it part of humanity's common heritage. There exists no memory that cannot become history, however tragic or unspeakable the event underlying it. In your lecture, Professor Oliver, you referred to Jan Assmann on the role of memory as Gedächtnisgeschichte or Mnemo-history, meaning that we remember an event different from how it actually happened or as more important than what actually happened. In mapping the church history in South Africa, and especially in teaching church history at UNISA, we need to connect church history to everything else. Envisioning a church history from below, in reconsidering the history and the futures of the Free Afrikaner churches connected to everything, we need to invite everyone to bring their suitcases of memories, not only the early dominees and church council members or synod members, but also the tannies who sold cook sisters and looked after the poor, but could not fulfill for very long any official roles like deacons or elders. We should invite also those who were good enough to clean the pulpit and polish the floors, but who could not attend the services on Sundays. We should invite them to bring their suitcases of memories, suffering, and identity. We should also invite those Afrikaners who were not white and therefore excluded from these Afrikaans churches for very long, to bring their suitcases of suffering, of identity, and memory. A church history from below will not mean that we compare sufferings, memories, and decide whose suffering was the worst. We will stare in silence, like you said, in awe, and possibly whisper, "I never knew." We may even whisper, "I knew, but did nothing." And that may be a good place to start for the future of Christian church history. Prof. Erna Oliver, I wish to welcome you as a fellow academic to the Professoriate, a community of scholars who know something, a community of scholars who constantly has to confess we don't know, and a community of humans who may whisper, "We never knew, but now that I know, I see and I will retell the history of my own as connected to everything else." Welcome, Prof. Oliver, and congratulations.
Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the University Council, the Senate, and the leadership of the university, please join me in officially welcoming Professor Erna Oliver to the ranks of full professor at the University of South Africa. Prof. Oliver, thank you for the complex, instructive, and provocative lecture. It comes at an opportune time as we are engaged in curricular deliberations and transformation. We as UNISA pride ourselves as the African university shaping futures in the service of humanity. We are pleased to have you amongst our professorate. On behalf of the University Council, Senate, and leadership, I congratulate you on having achieved this academic milestone. Ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of this morning's proceedings. Considering that we are doing this inaugural lecture online, I am sure you have planned for the celebrations of this day wherever you are. Please be safe, as always. Thank you very much.